Hello and welcome everyone joining us. I'm Eric Joyce with PreScouter. I'll be the MC today. We're going to give some of the other attendees a minute or two to join us. While we do that, I'll go over a couple of general housekeeping items. First, you'll see the poll to the right. You should see the poll. You should also see the question functionality. We want to make this session as interactive as possible. So please be on the lookout for poll questions that we'll publish there. All of your answers will be anonymous. It'll just help us better guide some of the discussions towards the latter part of today's call. And we will be trying to share the answer percentages with the group throughout. So you might get some insight as to where you sit compared to some of the other attendees today. We'll give everybody maybe one more minute. We've got a lot of information to get in today, but first, thank you, first of all, for your commitment and efforts towards more sustainable commerce, trying to get ahead of reducing your emissions and identifying the most viable opportunities to do that today. Give me 1 second. Give some others to join us. This is the second of our summits. Those of you who attended the first summit on COP26, Impact on Business, I want to thank you for recommending and selecting this as a topic for our second virtual summit this year. Also, I want to thank those of you who already sent questions and kind of topics that you'd like to hear throughout the day today. Why don't we go ahead and get started. Again, for those of you who just joined us, you'll see the poll on the right-hand side. We'd like to understand, when thinking about offsets, when thinking about RECs, GOES, CERs, kind of where your organization is at. Have you already decided that these need to be tools that you leverage to offset your carbon footprint, and you're just trying to select the best tool for your organization or the best specific solution? Is this an area you're just starting to consider, and you're not sure if offsets or RECs or GOES or other region-specific opportunities are right for you? So if you can give us an understanding as to where you fit, that would help us today. And why don't I go ahead and introduce Baishakhi and Christian, and then I'll get ready to turn it over to Christian to begin the discussion. Baishakhi is one of PreScouter's subject matter experts. Baishakhi, Christian is one of our technical directors, which means he leads our client work and projects in the emission reduction space, having performed hundreds of these with some of PreScouter's largest clients across, chemicals, high tech, CPG, energy, many different verticals, helping them understand what their carbon footprint is, helping them with target setting activities and reporting activities, as well as what we'll discuss today, analysis of the opportunities to reduce emissions and for a more thorough carbon management plan. Between Baishakhi and Christian, they have decades of experience supporting clients and employers on their path to carbon neutrality, many times, resulting in year-over-year seven-figure savings for the organizations that they've been working on behalf of. Without further ado, why don't I turn it over to Christian to begin?
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Eric. And hi, everybody. It's very nice to be speaking to you all here. So for this first part of the talk today, I will be walking you guys through the REC part of it. So the renewable energy certificates and how good or not as good they are compared to other decarbonization strategies. But we figured that before going specifically into the strategies, prices, and so on, it might be worth to spend a few minutes to put everybody up to speed into what a REC is. So, and I'm not going to take so long here, but a REC is actually stands for Renewable Energy Credit, or actually also Renewable Energy Certificate. And what it is, it's formally it represents the generation of 1 megawatt hour of electricity from a renewable energy source. So, but someone that is purchasing or acquiring a renewable energy credit, so a REC, that does not necessarily mean it is getting the electricity. So how does it work actually? So essentially, companies or different players can still acquire the electricity that they use from their local grid, but can also separately buy a renewable energy certificate. And with that, what they are doing is essentially being able to claim or account that the electricity that they are using is obtained from renewable energy sources. Regardless of if the real origin it's not, if they acquire also the REC, they are able to account for that into their overall emissions. That's the unbundled type of RECs. It could also be bundled, so essentially both the RECs and the electricity coming actually from the same place. But that depends in case by case. And why it is important, why this is important, well, all of or many of the organizations, as we have here examples, are going for carbon reduction targets, some of them also to net zero. And a big part of that is actually the scope 2 emissions, which account for the indirect emissions associated with the carbon footprint or the greenhouse gases emissions that are produced because of the energy that is used. So essentially, with this type of strategy, what one could do is decarbonize those type of emissions. So this is the REC, the Renewable Energy Credit, is actually the title or how they are called in the US. But that's not always the case. So we find different terminologies out there. And just to give a little bit more of context here, so what I have been referring to so far, it's essentially the way it is referred to in the United States. So the Renewable Energy Certificate or the REC, but there are equivalent type of systems or certificates in other part of the world. So here we're bringing also the case of Europe. In Europe, they are called or they are known as the GOs or Guarantee of Origin. And they are developed under the umbrella of the EU directive here. And the GOs, or actually the REGOs, as they are also called in the UK, they are the only recognized tool today to track renewable energy production. And it's purely a voluntary system in Europe. So that would be kind of the equivalent of the RECs, but in Europe. And there are some other small differences in terms of the terminology. So for example, whenever someone buys a REC, we in the US, we say that the RECs are being delivered to the buyer. And then once the sale is done and that is accounted for the buyer, we call that the REC is retired. And that's pretty much the same, but with different words in Europe. So essentially for the GOs in Europe, whenever the GO is acquired, then we say it's transferred to the other party. And once the GO is used or is allocated, so we say it is being cancelled. Why is it important? Particularly these last two things, so the retire or the cancel, and that's because of we want to always avoid the double counting. So essentially making sure that representation of a megawatt hour of electricity is only counted as once. So enough about the context and the definitions. So let's move a little bit more into some of the things that are maybe a little bit more interesting, which is the prices of the RECs, for example, and what are the drivers of those prices. So in the case of RECs and in the US, we have two big, one classification with two big categories. So one, we have the compliance market, or where RECs are bought and sold in a compliance market, or the voluntary markets, which are very, very different from each other. So essentially in the compliance market, what happens there is that utilities have to generate a certain amount or percentage of whatever energy they produce out of renewable energy sources. That's for the RPS. So in those kind of markets, they have to comply to higher standards too. So essentially they have to acquire those in specific regions, or they have to be produced by certain technologies such as solar PV maybe, or wind, or something like that. And what happens there is that if the utilities cannot generate that share of their energy through renewable sources, then what happens is that they need to go to the market and buy those RECs. And essentially that creates higher demand for the RECs, and hence higher market selling prices for the RECs in the compliance market. So on the other hand, in the voluntary market, there are no such restrictions for the utilities. Typically, the supply is way bigger than the demand, which again, in these supply and demand type of markets, that means that in the voluntary markets, the selling prices of the RECs are considerably lower than in the compliance market. So there are other drivers for the REC prices. We listed a few here too. So for example, and I also touched upon that before, so the type of technology that is being used to generate the actual electricity. So whether we are talking about wind energy or solar PV or any other renewable energy source, it also depends on the age of the generator, the volume that is available, and location, and many other variables that will also influence the price of the RECs. And in the majority of the cases, REC prices are not publicly reported, and that's simply because transactions are carried out between two parties, so a bilateral contract there between the buyer and the seller. They can also be sold in public auctions or via online exchange platforms, but that's part of the reason why it is sometimes a little bit difficult to get specific REC prices here and there, but there are some other ways around that too. So in order to also show a little bit, that's mostly about RECs, so the renewable energy certificates, as we call it in the US, but as I mentioned before, the equivalent in Europe would be the GOs. And the GOs would also guarantees of origin, apart from representing 1 megawatt hour of energy. The GOs could also be used to guarantee origin of other type of energy, for example, gases. So hydrogen, for example, could also undergo GOs, which is different from the RECs. But going back into the prices here, we also wanted to bring this quick graph by S&P that shows a little bit, also gives a little bit of flavor of the volatility sometimes of this market too, and how the prices of the GOs in this case depends also on different variables. So there's not only a volatility in terms of history, let's say, but also depending on how the energy in this case was produced, as I was saying before, whether solar, hydro, wind, or biomass produced, for example. So, and that's about, so far we've covered the definition, the drivers of the prices, but we want to put this into action and show a little bit more on how does the strategy of using RECs compare with other ways of decarbonizing. So for that matter, what we did is we put a simple exercise here that we wanted to share with you. So in this case, pretty straightforward. What we did is we compare the strategy of purchasing RECs versus the case of RECs versus solar energy through three situations, so three type of RECs. So and you can see them here as 1, 2, and 3. Essentially, whenever you can go with RECs in a voluntary market or RECs in compliance market. And actually, because there is quite a a difference or a range of RECs in compliance market. We use two simple examples here. One that we call here the cheap compliance market and the expensive compliance markets for simplicity. And in this example, so this RECs versus solar example, we assume a 50 kilowatt power installation in this case. We assume the capex as well as the operation and maintenance costs of solar generation in this simple model. And we accounted for the avoidance of buying electricity in the case of installing solar PV generation unit on site as profits for the solar PV strategy. So that's why you're seeing that the orange, yellow type of line here, it starts lower because of the capital investment, but then it goes up because of the avoidance of having to buy electricity because you are generating your own electricity, which is not the case when you're purchasing RECs. And also in this model, there are a few more things, but the last thing I wanted to mention about the considerations is that we also consider here a model that accounts for how those RECs might be changing in the next years to come. And that we did based on previous trajectory of RECs prices, as well as some regulatory and forecast situations that we assume in our model, and we consider that too in this strategy. So overall results, what we did here is we highlighted the 3 points where RECs start to be the most expensive solution, and on-site solar generation starts to be the most cost-effective solution. So very quickly here, point number 3, which is, as I was saying, the voluntary type of markets where the prices of the RECs are very low. So it might be many years until solar PV might be actually cost effective with such a low REC prices. But if we move to the compliance market, which is actually in the United States, majority of the states now, what we can see is that depending on whether we are talking on a cheap REC or an expensive REC, we might be looking at, or in all the cases, less than 10 years when that strategy of buying RECs is not a good idea, because actually on-site solar generation might be actually the most cost-effective solution. And in places where the REC prices are kind of, let's say, as we call it here, expensive, so that trade-off, so that return of investment, let's say, might actually be less than 5 years. So what we're trying to show here is that when considering RECs as a decarbonization strategy, many variables are in place here, but this type of analysis should always be done, because it might be very, very common the case that RECs might not be the preferred solution, economically speaking. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions at the Q&A session, but I hand it over now to my colleague, Baishakhi.
Thanks, Christian, for such a knowledgeable presentation. So in my slides, I'm hoping to share my experience of where sustainability strategies are going over the next decade or so. So most large corporates will be looking to quantify not just what their net zero aspirations, etc., are, especially if you've got science-based targets and if you're impacted by their new methodologies on forestry, land and agriculture. There will be a bit of a base load of emissions that you may not be able to act on, either because of technologies that don't exist for abatement, or due to lack of funding, etc., or the timing of it for your business. So it's best to look at RECs and carbon offsets as a way not just to offset the emissions that you don't want to take action on, but really to add a bit of additionality to your strategy. So I'm going to talk about 3 types, and moving on to the next slide about carbon offsets using blue credits. So this is something that the central banks and multilateral organizations are looking to use through debt financing. So a bit of background, because oceans absorb nearly 70% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, sequestering carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases naturally through ocean and seagrass and stuff is utterly important to help to get to the net zero impact that we all have to. Because the other implications that we see of weather patterns or climate extremes is only from 1/4 that is there in the atmosphere. So Blue ocean credits is a way of debt financing and investing for about 8 to 10 years, where organizations, where if they want to act on certain UN SDGs, such as acting on life below water, also taking direct action on climate change, can work with banks and other private equity fund organizations to invest long-term. You could even use your pension pots to work with your finance companies to see if that pot could be used for marine conservation, for mangrove protection, for seagrass protection, and it'll have n number of benefits, because it will not only help to augment part of the economy, which is worth 1.4 trillion US dollars per year. It will help to absorb, naturally sequester CO2, and therefore help with your additionality on your net zero strategy. As I explained, there are two types of bonds being issued in the market. There are use of proceeds bonds from sovereign funds, or KPI related bonds from ESG funds. But you really need to talk to your banks or the central bank in your country to be able to tap into this. I think this is really going to take off, because it is slightly different to the impact it has through carbon credits generated through afforestation programs on land, and has multiple benefits of impacting on biodiversity as well, which is a very hot topic and is considered as big a risk to our existence on planet Earth as climate change. International renewable energy certificates is an independent non-for-profit entity which operates in the countries highlighted in dark gray on the map. So the renewable energy certificates are generated through renewable energy programs and are generated for every megawatt hour of energy generated through those sources in those countries. They're traded on independent platforms backed by the governments in those countries. And there is thorough paperwork associated with those. The renewable energy projects that generate these carbon credits are usually through carbon capture, use and storage, or the innovative ones that are looking at hydrogen economy. There's also ADI and biogas related projects that generate the carbon offsets. So say, for example, if an ADI plant generates carbon offsets through producing biodiesel, which can be used in smaller fleet, that can generate carbon credits that can be retired into the registry. So this is an independent, non-for-profit carbon offsetting platform that is not very common in the European market, but I think the market for carbon offsets and the demand for it is just going to grow 15 to 50% between now and 2030, purely because of the demand to neutralize, and there just isn't enough options available at the right market price to do the abatement. Having said that, obviously don't lose your focus on decarbonization of the fossil fuels that you're using within your operations. I mean, the first point is to reduce usage of those. Moving on to certified emissions reduction schemes, I've personally used them. These are generated by developing countries using multilateral protocols such as the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework for Convention for Climate Change. So there is a robust registry called Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, as I refer to in my slide. So you can Google that, and they have a list of all the projects through which the carbon offsets are generated. The carbon offset is worth 1 ton of CO2, and they're generated through loads of different processes. They can be either through hydroelectric power generation, they can be through afforestation programs, they can be through community woodland project, other conservation efforts happening for creating natural carbon sinks in developing countries. This is quite big because I think we ought to explore every opportunity there is to neutralize the impact of greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, the prices for the certified emissions reductions are at about $5 per unit. But as I've mentioned, and there are various reports by the big four accountancy firms, that the prices for this are going to soar between now and 2030. And this is also going to be impacted by the carbon border tax that Europe is looking to phase in between now and 2026. So hopefully that gives you a flavor for other options available on carbon offsets. So with that, I think I'm going to hand back to my lovely colleague, Eric,
Yep.
for the final session.
Thanks. And actually, first, we had a quick question on the slide of the IREX slide. What does the blue color of the map represent, if you want to go to that?
The dark blue or the light blue? So the dark blue is basically countries that are participating in the International Renewable Energy Certificate Scheme through this independent non-profit organization that is generating the carbon credits through renewable energy generation. So as you can see, it's a big market. And there's valid paperwork to back up your carbon offsets.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. We've got a couple minutes left. I think the key takeaways before we address some of your other questions are that, there is no one size fits all solution, that you really need to carefully investigate the specific offsets, RECs, et cetera, available in your space, what your goals are as an organization, both short term and long, because these are ever changing. And the different agencies, like some of the questions that we've gotten on science-based target reductions, they have updated their advice and guidance on different tools throughout the year. So that's why our clients come to us to investigate these. Our network of 5,000 plus subject matter experts, like Baishakhi, who have experience in this space, our technical directors like Christian, who are regularly investigating various customized solutions for our clients so they can make the most informed decisions on their carbon management strategy and how to reach their goals, whether that be net zero or 1.5 degrees under science-based targets. So one of the questions we got was, are CERs counted for science-based target reductions? Baishakhi, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So carbon offsets, as we know, is not directly allowed with offsetting is not really allowed within science-based targets if you have got science-based targets approved by the Targets Initiative. However, they are currently sort of looking at it as a measure of additionality if it helps for natural carbon sequestration through geological sinks or through, helps to augment biodiversity. So hence why I shared those insights into other carbon offsets available, because they're looking at multiple benefits. Especially, I talked about the flag methodology that they're coming up with, which is not yet finalized, but they're looking to publish it in March. So under the flag methodology, they do acknowledge that such carbon offsets using only as a medium of additionality, the base load that I talked about, which you may not be able to shift between now and 2030. So using those type of scenarios to hopefully address through certified emissions reduction schemes. You need to pick the project so that it links in with what SBTi requires. So for example, if you were to buy certified emission reduction schemes from a hydroelectric dam, may not be acceptable in flag. So I suggest, because there's a lots of options available around which projects you can buy certified emissions reductions carbon offsets from. So yeah, you should pick that. And also based on what your organizational overall objective is to achieve your sustainability strategy.
So as usual, what sounds like a simple question doesn't always have a simple answer. Another question we got is can you use IREX instead of RECs to reduce Scope 2 emissions, even if RECs are available in your country or countries of operation? And then second question on that is, would that be accepted by CDP for market-based reporting? Is that something you want to provide some general guidance on, Baishakhi? And real quickly, before we've got 1 minute left, anyone who attended today's session, we're offering a 30-minute session with Baishakhi or Christian, one of our subject matter experts, to speak about some of these, let's say, more specific questions so that we can answer them more thoroughly for you. So I welcome you to reply to some of the emails and the recording link and say, yes, I'd love that 30-minute session with your team. Baishakhi, do you want me to repeat that question or?
So I kind of got a drift of it. It's about the IREX and REX, isn't it? So I think it will depend on what is your strategy trying to do. So if you're part of a global company and you have operations in countries where, for example, the renewable energy market is probably not as advanced, however, you do have an environmental impact there, or maybe as part of your materiality analysis in your supply chain, what you procure from that country has a big impact on your strategy or has a key role to play in your business. So in those scenarios, I think it would be perfectly okay to look at IREX to address impact of that country. But whether you can replace IREX with REX in, say, states where the judicial system is quite strict, such as California, that might be something you need to look into the details of, especially with CDP reporting. They might have their own nuances on those.
Perfect. And then another question we have is, are there any good resources that forecast REC pricing into the future? And before you answer that, this was a theme we got in a lot of the questions in advance. Do we expect REC prices to increase? Is there a database or a specific place you can turn to try to find REC pricing, or what RECs and similar geos might be available? Baishakhi, are there good resources that forecast REC pricing into the future? Or Christian?
I think that might be a question for Christian.
Okay, Christian.
Well, actually, I don't know who that is, because there is no one perfect place to look at this. I would say there are many different platforms that offer different type of solutions. What I would recommend is usually document some work done by the DOE and the National Renewable Energy Lab. That's definitely first place to look at with very serious research there. Apart from that, there are many different places where some of that information might be obtained.
Great. Go ahead,
to
Baishakhi.
finish that off, Eric, I just wanted to add that there is a forecast, no matter which web you look at, that the price of this is bound to increase because there just isn't enough going around to help with getting to carbon neutrality. So some websites are saying it might increase to 15-fold the demand and the price for it between now and 2030. But I reckon that might be even higher because carbon border tax is coming into Europe, which is going to push companies having to, enough mechanisms in place to be able to pay for the carbon tax.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And then one of the questions we got in advance was, how can I check the efficacy of offset projects or ensure that they are bona fide projects that I could receive credit for?
So with the, for example, Certified Emissions Reduction Scheme or the IREX, there is established methodology that is available on their website. So you can, in your own time, or use your own auditors to look through the information. It's all published. It's all validated using external agencies. Both mechanisms are overseen by the national governments in the countries these schemes operate in. So it's highly likely that it's thoroughly validated. From my own experience of buying Certified Emissions Reduction Scheme, there is volumes of paperwork to back up the carbon offsets, how it was generated and how it has been retired into the registry. Therefore, carbon emissions of that X amount shouldn't reappear in the global budget. So if you're interested, have a look at it. All the carbon offsets, specifically through the Certified Emissions Reduction Schemes, are validated by third-party auditors such as VNV, BSI, etc., other third-party auditing sources, and that's all published on the CDM registry. So you can have, there's clear paper trail of information.
Great. And for those of you who maybe didn't see the poll results, has your company utilized RECs or other similar methods of offsetting your carbon footprint? 60% of you said yes. 2, no, not yet. 20% no, not yet, and 10% currently investigating and considering looking at these. About half of you hope to understand how to analyze between different reduction or offsetting solutions, which is a question we get a lot, is how do you make decisions between whether it's on-site generation, all of the different tools that you might be able to leverage that have different costs today and different long-term costs or benefits. And then finally, for blue bonds, about 70% of the attendees said they're not sure if blue bonds are right for you, which is probably the correct answer, right? We've been saying today, you have to look into these things a little bit more thoroughly and see how they fit with your overarching strategy. And about 30% thought they might align well with their goals. We've got a number of attendees still with us. If there's any other questions, please feel free to add them to the question or the chat functionality. Again, we'll be sending out a link to the recording. We'll also be offering a 30-minute session with either Baishakhi or Christian or one of our experts in the space to answer any of your specific questions and provide additional guidance. PreScouter was set up to, over the last 11 years to answer these very complex questions in developing and evolving technology and market areas. Our network of experts, of technical researchers led by our technical directors like Christian to answer your questions over a stage-gated approach is really why our clients say they come to us time and time again, because we can get very deep technically and provide recommendations or guidance that align with their specific scenarios and goals today and looking into the future. So if there are no further questions, thank you again, everyone, for taking some time out of your busy day. We hope to speak with you in the coming weeks and share any one-on-one guidance we can, and be on the lookout for an invite to our next virtual summit on sustainability initiatives. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.